Thank you very much for the introduction, Kevin. That's great. So there's my title. I'm going to be racing through quite a lot of things today. I've got a few little disclaimers to make first. Given that we're talking about diet, I'm not a dietitian, I'm not a health professional. I have actually published a paper in Health Science before, but that had nothing to do with human diet. So that is not my area. So I'm happy to sort of delve into that subject to a degree, but only in my capacity as an archaeologist. So my expertise is mostly on past human activity, especially looking at plant use and domestication, and more pertinently looking at human impact on past environments as well. So one of the things I like to sort of raise initially whenever we're sort of looking at some aspect of research is what is the function of research now, and looking at the philosophy of science. And more it seems to me that what we're dealing with is we're trying to discover things that aren't in Google if we're true researchers, and we're trying to challenge things which are in Google. And I think this is very relevant when we're trying to develop a very tight, rational view of the world when we've got this one source of information which we trust. So I think as a role I see as a researcher and as an educator in a university, it's like, well, let's have a look at some things which aren't on Google. So that's what I hope to do tonight to a degree, is give you some insights into what I've been looking at. Some of it's on Google, of course, from some of the work that I've done, but and to challenge some of the ideas that are actually posted up on Google with regard to the subject this evening, which is palaeodiets. So yeah, more pertinently, I'm trying to look at to seek consilience and recognise the dangers of correlation as causation. That's one of the things we're trying to do as researchers as well, and then carefully assess this idea of theory fitting in the absence of evidence. And this is one of the big things that we're dealing with tonight with, I think, with the palaeodiet, is that we're really trying to create a diet based on very little evidence, essentially. So we'll go from there. My own skeptical roots. I first saw James Randi in 1992, actually. I was like, I can't remember what I was doing at the time, but he had an absolutely jam-packed theatre, and I'm from New Zealand, if you can't tell, and I've just come back from there, so my accent's probably more stronger than usual. I like to think that I brought the weather with me, but there's a drought over there at the moment, and that's impossible anyway. I had great fondness in reading Michael Shermer's book on why people believe weird things, and that gave me some great insights into some of the sort of superstitions and pseudoscience that confront my own family. And with my own personal experience, I have family members who are good at confabulation. So I found that book really fabulous in explaining why various people in my family believe the things that they do, and I won't go into that in too much detail, but at all really. But it's I think the overall approach of the skeptic is a good one. Okay, straight on to the palaeodiet. So this is an image of a very flash-looking dish from a restaurant entitled Paleo in Copenhagen. It's on TripAdvisor there, and it's very highly rated, and there's a nice green cup of something coupled with lots of vegetables, and I think it's a patty filled with lots of nuts and other things, which looks to me like a perfectly fantastic dish. I've got absolutely no problems with the idea that eating fresh vegetables and a nutritious meal, hopefully that's tasty as well. Absolutely no problems at all. And so the main function, I think, behind the palaeodiet is presumably comparing it to the refined carbohydrate-based neo-diet, if you want to call it a neo-diet versus a palaeodiet. But if we really want to get down to sort of more archaeological terms, then we should be thinking about the Paleolithic versus the Neolithic, perhaps, in terms of looking at the pre and post development of agriculture as some kind of major shift towards refined carbohydrates, which what I would like to address tonight is that these ideas are changing quite rapidly as we get to understand more about how humans modified their environment in the past and how they focused in and honed in on certain species to their own ends. There's a little note about the Mesolithic, which is increasingly being shifted between the Neolithic and the Paleolithic. It's becoming a narrow corridor between 20,000 and about 10,000 years ago, but that's been shifted back all the time. So I'm pretty sure the Mesolithic may no longer exist pretty soon. Agricultural versus domestication, which came first. This is another big question within archaeology itself. There's some new evidence, which I see Colin Grove is here tonight, but there's new evidence for the domestication process behind dogs, suggesting that it was well before agricultural development. I'm not sure that's a substantially new idea, but there was a paper that came out recently on that in January, which is based purely on genetic data and molecular dating, but was quite convincing that either humans have been domesticating dogs or dogs have been domesticating humans well prior to the development of agriculture. We've got increasingly early evidence for the domestication of rice, wheat crops, you know, all the major grain staples. The evidence seems to be shifting back every year with it's quite astonishing, especially with the development of archaeology within China itself. The number of excavations and huge, large-scale excavations that have been conducted in China at present have really shifted everyone's thinking on how a lot of these processes worked. Okay, so the palaeodiet, there's a basic premise to the palaeodiet, and it's simply that the idea, the assumption, that Paleolithic people consumed very little simple carbohydrates, so very little sugars, refined sugars, and very little in the way of grain-based diet as well. So, you know, not based entirely on rice or one particular carbohydrate staple, which is what we think of as being a characteristic of an agricultural society. And there's the idea that it's more nutritious, that there was less famines and malnutrition. This is off Google, by the way. Less famine, less malnutrition, and less diseases of affluence, things like diabetes and coronary heart disease and so on. So there's all these different things which we really don't know. We've got absolutely no idea. A lot of the diseases, for example, the diseases of affluence, would leave no trace archaeologically. So it's very, very difficult for us to actually determine that. Of course, we do have genetic data which can tell us a lot about the origin of certain diseases, and that is pointing further and further back all the time, I believe, as well, with many of some of the major diseases of the modern age. Famine and malnutrition, well, that's very debatable. In terms of nutrition, there's a book here which I'll allude to throughout the evening, which is Richard Wrangham's book called Catching Fire, and it's how cooking made us human. And he essentially goes into the ideas behind how cooking is so important that it actually basically really hyped human evolution to such a degree it could be used to explain the rapid development of the human brain. It could also be used to explain the rapid escalation in size of certain human societies as well with cooking. But I'll go into that a little bit later on. Definitions, well, I was sort of really hunting through the definitions of paleo too, seeing whether or not there's any sort of inappropriate use of the word paleo. I mean, there is some subtleties to the word. Basically, it is, with the OED definition, it's really just something belonging to the past, particularly geological or prehistoric. But it's also potentially has some function. I mean, I'm in danger of this myself, given that I call myself a palaeoecologist as well, so I should be careful about how I use that word. But it's also sort of applies to wisdom of an age as well. So I think whether or not we can apply this in this context, I'm not sure. But anyway, you can take or leave that. Now, so the whole paleo diet seems to be like a great marketing venture. It sort of beautifully weaves science and mysticism. And there was the book by Zuck, entitled Paleo Fantasies, and it was really about how people are increasingly romanticising the past and the life of the Paleolithic people, as if there was some kind of high ideal set in there somewhere. And it is a fantastic idea to create an ancestral diet from almost no evidence, and based, I think, on that single assumption about carbohydrates, which is really where I want to head with this talk, is looking at what evidence we have archaeologically for carbohydrate consumption. The term paleo diet itself does have other meanings too in science literature as well. So more often than not, if you're hunting through science journals, you'll see a lot of references to work on stable isotopes, looking at can you differentiate between, based on looking at stable isotopes from bones, for example, looking at the diet of someone who's consuming mostly marine species versus someone who's consuming terrestrial or land-based organisms. And there are some other subtleties that can be approached with using stable isotopes. Increasingly, we're seeing work on dental calculus as well, which is in fact the scrapings from teeth, which you basically the wear patterns on teeth, and you can find certain microfossils and other compounds buried within a tooth that have been embedded there by the chewing action over the life of the individual. That's highlighting a lot about diet as well, in terms of what people might be consuming as well. And then, of course, there's the whole bioanthropology and paleopathology side of looking at human bones and seeing what kind of, or whether there's malnutrition or disease effects on those bones too. Okay, so caveats in the paleo diet model. Well, we've got the non-processed high carbohydrate foods like fruits, for example. I mean, fruit produce a lot of sugars. That's important whether you're an agricultural society or a Paleolithic society. And the other one, getting back to Richard Wrangham's book, which is the importance of processed carbohydrates as well. One of the ideas with early hominids was possibly, who getting out onto the savannah in Africa, is that they might have been following around after natural fires that occurred, picking cooked tubers from the savannah as a ready source of nutritious food. There are, of course, there's all sorts of other ideas about fermentation as well, and I'll get to that because there's a new research paper that came out just in the last 2 weeks, which actually looks at that a little bit as well, which I think really opens up the door for a lot of discussion about Paleolithic diets as well. And also other caveats, well, you've got the restricted food resources in the Pleistocene too. So some societies relied probably entirely on carbohydrates to a degree, and others might have relied entirely on meat to a degree as well. And in this sense, it also points to the adaptability, especially of modern humans, to different environmental settings too. So, and the fact that we can cope with incredibly diverse conditions and potentially incredibly diverse diets as well. So I think that's quite a major caveat in the paleo diet model. Okay, to the cooking hypothesis. This is not necessarily originally proposed by Richard Wrangham. There was other archaeologists and anthropologists like Levi Strauss, who looked at the nature of society and what effect cooking might have actually had in restructuring those traditional societies. But some of the ideas behind this hypothesis are that there was a massive change in the hominid digestive system, allowing for massive consumption of starch and very complex carbohydrates, which, if you look at the capacity of a lot of other early humans, well, we're not necessarily sure, but other species like gorillas, for example, and their capacity to eat large amounts of carbohydrates, the whole digestive system operates quite differently. And did this actually lead to a major expansion in brain size as well? Was this very important? And again, getting back to that idea of the availability of cooked carbohydrate sources like the tubers on the African savanna. Human use of fire as well, the evidence is a little unclear on this, how far it goes back. We do know that it's very old. Some of the oldest sites in South Africa, for example, early hominids, there seems to be evidence that there was cooking involved from charcoal remains, but it's still a little unclear exactly how far that goes back and the human control of fire. Potentially changed the whole social fabric of different societies as well. One argument that Richard makes is that it results in increased productivity through employment of females in cooking, more energy-rich food as well. And he notes, that's just an aside really, that it was interesting that Darwin didn't really see fire and cooking as a major selective pressure, and yet there would be clear sort of evolutionary trade-offs with this as well. So there's all these other things that come with this idea of cooking, which I think is really interesting. Given that cooking is in fact part of the process which is converting quite complex carbohydrates into simpler carbohydrates and sugars and so on, simply by the cooking process. So it's actually creating more energy-rich food just by that action alone. So it's pretty important, and that's something which I'm, from reading a little bit more about the paleo diet, the diet that we're talking about today, cooking is, you would have heard about the raw food diet as well, and this is similarly, I think the paleo diet encapsulates that raw food diet to a degree from my reading. Okay, so this is a recent paper that came out looking at disease and root exposure, periodontal disease and root exposure from Homo georgicus. And so from a site in Georgia, and it highlights the clear tooth decay, suggesting that much of the tooth decay is actually coming from carbohydrate consumption and fruit consumption and so on, which is not really surprising. We do know of that, that early species of Homo would have been consuming a lot of fruit as well, but this increasing amount of evidence is suggesting that this is clearly quite an important process, and suggests that those early species would have been mulling on different fibrous tubers perhaps, and incorporating bits of soil particles which might have also damaged teeth. But then as the chewing process evolved with the development of salivary glands or something, I mean, we're not really sure on those details, I don't think, but that might have involved, again, the reduction of complex carbohydrates into refined sugars as well, which would lead to tooth decay as well. So that's some really interesting data there. There's this picture of Richard and then some of the other Homo erectus related species to Homo georgicus. Comparing that with Paranthropus in the African savanna, suggesting that they weren't just eating meat, they were consuming a lot of carbohydrate as well. But this is one of the key papers which I think, this just came out a week or two ago in the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences in the US, and which suggests that Pleistocene hunter-gatherers from Morocco about 15,000 years ago were consuming an awful lot of starchy tuberous things. And here's some of the evidence from in this image here of some of the classic dental cavities that you might see in a modern industrialised society who don't use toothpaste, of course. Brushing obviously helps quite substantially. They looked at, it's an astonishing site really, with 52 adults dated between 15 and 13,000 years ago, and greater than 50% of them had major tooth decay and dental disease. So that's quite astonishing, really. It suggests that represents some kind of similar diet to modern industrial societies based on refined carbohydrates. And of that population, there were only 3 adults without tooth decay, which is pretty remarkable in a sense as well. And so what these authors have suggested is that they were in fact basically making a sort of a gruel and like a porridge out of a range of different carbohydrate sources, whether that being grains from different grass species or from nuts, which are of course composed of a lot of protein, but there was also a lot of carbohydrate within nuts as well, including pine nuts in this case and acorns, which were the major part of their diet. So here's the numbers of macrofossils that they found of these plant remains within that actual site, which is, as I say, it's really quite a phenomenal site, I think, archaeologically. And you can see the numbers there of the acorns and of the pine nuts too. So that was the major contributor to their diet, they think. So what would they have been doing with these nuts as well? As I say, the idea of a gruel, but they were clearly roasting the nuts, because we do see some fragments of acorns and of pine nuts and other things within the actual assemblage as well. You can see those black fragments there are little bits of charred remain. It's the kind of thing that I work on in archaeological sites, these tiny little bits of charred nut that you find, and try and determine what species it might have been. And so they're cooking these nuts anyway. And I would suggest that if their ideas are right, they might have been perhaps fermenting some of these nuts. They might have been roasting them. They might have gone through a whole number of different processing techniques to actually sweeten the nuts and create a lot of sugars out of them, whether that would be in a gruel, a porridge, or there's any number of possibilities really. Hopefully they wouldn't end up with teeth like this, but that's a more modern day example. But the evidence from Morocco is very, very important. And so yeah, the seeds were either dried, roasted, caramelized. They could have been baked into a bread. These authors are sort of suggesting all sorts of possibilities from this particular find. So anyway, what is clear is that the increased sugar loading would have been way above what would have been provided by fruit alone. So this is really intriguing. It's also interesting to me that with those nuts, of course, because they would have been obtained seasonally, it does suggest that those people were probably storing food. So whether they were making up a gruel, which they would have kept over a season to keep them through the winter months, that is a possibility as well. It's really unclear, but it does open the door to a lot of possibilities. It also opens up the possibility that they might have been creating alcohol. I mean, who knows? I mean, that's one of the bigger debates that we have for agricultural societies, is when did people first starting producing large amounts of alcohol? And it comes to this beer or bread question within the Paleolithic as well. It's is that possible? Is it possible that people were like baking bread out of acorn meal or what have you? I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities, really. So this kind of archaeological assemblage really opens up the door, I think. And I'd like you to take note of that particular site in the context of some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues up in Papua New Guinea, which is where I'll get on to next, given that what we've been finding up there are similarly lots and lots of nuts and charred nuts, but we know what people have been doing with them today, but was this in fact the case in the Paleolithic in New Guinea as well? Just a quick overview of some of the Paleolithic sites, or the early Pleistocene sites within the archaeology of Australasia. Here's some of them. Not all of them are listed there, but some of the major ones are there. And I'm just going to quickly go to one of Professor Sue O'Connor, who's an ARC laureate fellow in our department in archaeology and natural history at the ANU. And one of her famous sites is the Carpenter's Gap site, which was a really large rock shelter. There's some incredibly impressive rock shelters over in the Kimberley, and Sue's actually currently working on some more rock shelters over there, but she did that work begun that close to 20 years ago now. And here's the sort of proportion of different remains that you find in that site. Sorry for the detail, but you've got over a period, looking at the bottom, so it's 120 centimetre deep deposit, and it goes down to about 40,000 years at the bottom, and then up to about 1,000 years at the top. And so you see different composition of bone, preservation of stone, of charcoal, and of plant macrofossils and birds' egg shells, and so on and so forth. And what you also find is some evidence of seeds and nuts as well, being preserved mostly from about 25,000 years on. And this is it's not a typical assemblage within a Pleistocene archaeological site in Australia. It's actually probably quite unusual in a sense, but it's what we would hope to find in a lot of these sites. What was missing from this site, unfortunately, was substantial amounts of bone like you would have wanted to find in the early part of the sequence, lots of megafauna, for example, or who knows if you're interested in that particular debate. But anyway, they're consuming a whole range of different things. So they're consuming meat, they're consuming shellfish, they're consuming fruits and nuts, and also fauna as well, animals. So they've got a very diverse diet. So it's not like they're sticking to one thing. But I want to focus again on the nuts as well, because with that paper that came along, it sort of gets you thinking about, well, would people have been processing those nuts for sugars? And because in Australia we don't have sites with Pleistocene sites with 52 burials attached where we can look at their teeth from one particular site. And that Moroccan site is really something else in that sense. But is it possible that people in these types of settings were really after sugars, which seems to me that they probably were, and could they have been using nuts for that purpose? Okay, I'm going to move over to New Guinea now, and New Guinea is interesting for numerous reasons. One of them is that you hear about all these things about New Guinea, that it's got 1/6 of the world's languages, for example. It's a real cultural melting pot. It's extremely diverse environments, lowland tropics you've even got glaciers right up on the top of New Guinea. It's got a very similar human colonisation time frame to Australia, about 50,000 years. And we do have some very early evidence for plant use as well, and also the independent development of agriculture. So it's got it all, and it's part of the Australasian continent as well. So I think it's something really important, New Guinea. Here's all the domestication centres, just pointing out that New Guinea itself is, in fact, in the centre there, is one of the independent domestication centres particularly for a lot of plant species. It's really important for plants, it's really important for carbohydrates. And in terms of looking at this whole idea of the paleodiet, New Guinea is carbohydrate central, and I don't think it's just because of its independent development of agriculture there as well. There are a lot of plants which are filled with carbohydrates, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which I think would have been important for any Paleolithic society in that area. And here's some of the major archaeological sites in New Guinea, both Pleistocene and later as well. Funnily enough, most of them are found in the highlands, right up at high elevation, which is still perplexing us a little bit as to why the earliest sites would be found there. It could be something to do with preservation conditions. It could be a whole bunch of things. But it's kind of interesting that people really seem to head up there, and they headed up into the high elevation areas up to about 2,000 metres or above very, very rapidly. I mean, the earliest site we've got is from number 1 there in the Owen Stanley range where I've been working. The earliest dates we've got for New Guinea up at a site in Kosepe, which I'll talk about a bit later. So what possible Paleolithic carbohydrates could you get from New Guinea? Well, one of the major ones is sago, and I don't know if I'm sure a lot of people have heard of sago, and it's still eaten widely, of course, in Southeast Asia, and it was a major war food in Australia and New Zealand and as well. And it's basically it's a palm tree which produces huge amounts of carbohydrate. And there's a lot of debate actually about its importance in different societies throughout Southeast Asia and New Guinea. But its production is such that one tree can feed one family for many, many weeks. So it's an incredibly valuable food supply, and we don't actually have that much evidence for its consumption in the Paleolithic settings, unfortunately. We've got some evidence for leaf fragments from some archaeological sites, but in my view, given its prevalence in New Guinea, and I'll show you a map of its distribution later, it has to be a major target for carbohydrate consumption by any human. The other major one is the banana, and the banana is made in New Guinea, and what's intriguing about the banana, in fact, is that we often think of it as a fruit, but probably for most of its history in terms of its relationship with humans, people were probably mostly consuming it as its stems like sago, for its internal pith and the carbohydrate value embedded within the stem. There would have been other tubers. I won't talk about tubers too much here, but there are hundreds and hundreds of species of tuberous plants in New Guinea which have food value. So that's an important thing to think about as well. And we're not really sure. We know that a number of them have been domesticated in New Guinea. We're not sure which the first ones are. We think that yams, Dioscorea, but also things like taro, colocasia, that they were domesticated very early in New Guinea. But whatever the case is, tuberous plants are incredibly abundant there, and you can get a lot of food value out of them as well, simply by cooking, of course. So they were, I believe, an important food source. And I'll point to some of the evidence that we have for Paleolithic, early Pleistocene sites with the consumption of yams as well. The last one I'll talk about is the tree fern. It's very much like sago in a sense that you can actually get a lot of carbohydrate value out of the trunk of a tree fern. And I've done a bit of experimental archaeology in New Guinea with cooking tree fern trunks to see what kind of value we can actually get out of them. And I had a lot of fun with a lot of the local groups that I worked with, because most of them believe that the first thing they would say is that you're going to die if you eat that. You can't possibly eat Cyathea tree fern trunks. And so anyway, we did it and we were fine, and you can eat it and it's fine. And in some countries, in different Pacific islands, also in Southeast Asia, people do consume tree fern and other fern species as well. Yeah, anyway. So back to the sago tree. Most of the palms in the foreground there are in fact nipa, another species, but the one in the centre is a sago, Metroxylon sago. And this is on the East Sepik north coast of Papua New Guinea. This is sort of typically the remains of what's left of a trunk, and just a guy there for scale and just allowing you to realise just how much carbohydrate you can actually get out of a trunk. So it's like a boat basically, and all of that was carved out for carbohydrate essentially. There's a whole lot of processing techniques that take place. You can see a guy on the top there splitting the sago, trying to pull out the pith of the sago, and then you've got to wash it, the washing process to get rid of a lot of the coarser, I've eaten sago which isn't processed very well, and it's a bit like eating sawdust. But if you do it well, it can be pretty nice. And then there's the cooking side of it as well, and then there's also storage as well. And some people ferment the sago pudding a little bit as well, and you can actually store it over a season, and it's perfectly good over a season as well. But again, the actual longevity, the time depth, the antiquity of sago consumption is something that, well, we're not really sure about. Now here's a map of Papua New Guinea showing the distribution of different types of sago cultivation and the different extent of sago swamps. So you've got some areas where sago is an absolute staple. It's the main staple, so that's the purple areas of Papua New Guinea. And you can see that's a huge area, and that's where it's the potato of their culture. It's what everyone's eating every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And those areas are covered in sago trees. So they've got areas which have managed sago stands, and they've got areas which are so-called wild sapsack, so wild sago stands as well. And so essentially there's a huge resource there for a lot of different societies within Papua New Guinea. And what we've noted and what we've tried to do with some of our work there is try and look at some of the areas on the margins of sago cultivation to try and detect when sago might have been first cultivated per se. So when people were first like grabbing a fruit or cutting off a branch and planting it and cultivating sago as you would in terms of agriculture as well. And so we've been looking in some of the marginal sites, like up in the high elevation areas. Sago can actually grow up to about 1,000 metres in elevation. And there's a lot of fascinating anecdotes of people going down to the lowlands to the coastline and cutting a sago trunk, putting it on their back, and walking back up to their village, which might be at up to about 1,500 metres in elevation or more. There is one anecdote of a guy who trekked for weeks to get down to the coast, had a big trunk of sago on his back, and his village is at 2,000 metres. So he wanted to plant sago at his village at 2,000 metres. So it's quite weird, but anyway, it didn't. Of course, it died, so it was a bit of a failure. But it was still interesting that people would go to that extent to have a sago tree, and because of its inherent value for a plant. I mean, you can use it for all sorts of other things as well, thatching for roofs, and so on and so forth. It's multi-purpose, so it's a fantastic tree. So those are the sites that I've been focusing on for my work, and the way I do that is I usually go to a swamp or a lake, and I take a sediment core, and then I bring that back to Australia and I radiocarbon date it, and then I look for a whole bunch of different, there's a sediment core there, working with some local guys. And this is in the East Sepik province of Papua New Guinea. This was the most mosquito-infested place I've ever been. It was unbelievable how many mosquitoes there were, but anyway, I didn't get a bout of malaria from that particular trip, which was quite fortunate, but we got some good calls out of it. And these are the kinds of things that I look for traces of sago. So we've got things like pollen here up on the right. We've got phytoliths, which are these little silica crystals that we find You can even find little bits of beetle that feed specifically on sago. That's the sago beetle, which people consume the grubs of the sago beetle as another food source. And then you've got starch grains as well. And what we've found is in some of these sites that sago actually expanded in production around about the same time as you expect with the independent development of agriculture. But we have actually found, as I was saying before, some sago leaf fragments from some 15,000-year-old archaeological sites in the north coast of New Guinea as well. So it's likely, I mean, the story is unclear, but sago is an important one. Again, I'm talking about this plant again just to emphasize again that it's a tree which is very easy to produce a huge amount of carbohydrate, much easier than growing a rice paddy field. And there's a lot of debate amongst various colleagues of mine who are agronomists or agricultural scientists about the value of, like, well, should we be planting other crops like rice in New Guinea versus sago? But in my view, sago is a very, very stable, secure crop for a lot of different people in different communities in Papua New Guinea. Okay, bananas made in New Guinea. This is the classic Cavendish banana, but whenever talking about New Guinea, I mean, if someone who's talking about New Guinea should always talk about bananas, really. And the main reason is that there are hundreds and hundreds of different varieties of bananas from New Guinea, but this is pretty much one of the 2 or 3 that we ever find in the shops in Australia and globally generally. And these ones aren't actually all that old. So this is the Cavendish banana, and it's got very, very high carbohydrate value, obviously, so up to 80% carbohydrate. So it's a valuable carbohydrate source. But these are some of the younger bananas. So we've got not only the Musa, that's the Cavendish ancestor of the Cavendish banana, but we've also got another form of banana, the insete, which is also found in Africa. It's only found in the highlands in parts of New Guinea and in parts of the Ethiopian highlands. So it's quite a weird distribution. But that also produces bananas, and there's the Musa as well, and there's a Cavendish there, and then there's a number of other varieties. So they're related to Heliconia. And here's some of the wild type bananas that you find in Papua New Guinea, which are really astonishing, and they are all seeded bananas. So they're just full of seeds. There's not much pulp. You don't get much food value out of them. So you can eat them. Some of them can be quite sugary. Some of them can have virtually, you can't really do much with them at all. And as I say, a lot of bananas were actually probably concentrated on for their stems for food production as well before their fruit. So there was a whole genetic set of steps that with hybridization of different species of the ancestors of the modern bananas, and this is sort of some of the genetic work. And essentially, parthenocapy, which is the sort of removal of seeds, took place mostly in Papua New Guinea, with different hybridizations between different species across Southeast Asia and different mixing, probably through the movement of people. So people, and probably in pre-agricultural as well. We really don't know. We've got no idea about the timing of a lot of these different things. But then they're hybridized with other small island groups, bananas on different island groups as well, and then hybridized with bananas in Indonesia. And then we've got this big picture of seedless bananas that we know about today within Papua New Guinea. So it's a really interesting story, but it's just one of those big question marks, and yet it's a major carbohydrate producer which potentially Paleolithic people would have been consuming. You can't talk about New Guinea without talking about Cook Swamp if you're an archaeologist as well. And there's Professor Jack Golson, who's still heads into work every day. We see Jack really regularly. And he put down up in Cook Swamp, which is at about 1,800 metres in elevation, a set of excavations looking at these different drainage features that lined, this is a modern sweet potato production field, which someone was digging a hole and found some stone implements and other things. So, and Jack was highlighted back in the mid-60s to go up there and put down these large-scale excavations which have opened up these different terrace systems. And then one of his students, Tim Denham, who now runs the master's program in archaeology at the ANU, did some more detailed work of that, outlining these different drainage features, and employed people to look at the fossil remains and did substantial dating of those deposits as well. But the key thing for that particular site is that they found some microfossils of different bananas. And some of them are quite early as well, back to about 10,000 years ago, where you find bananas growing at that particular site. So as you saw before, it's just an open field sweet potato area. Doesn't look like a place that you would grow bananas. But back 9,000 plus years ago, there were a couple of different species of banana growing there. And it's possible that this was the stage set for the domestication of the banana, that whole process of parthenocarpy, with people selecting different varieties and then eventually ending up with seedless ones, seedless fruited varieties and so on. And so that process is perhaps found here. And what you find in these colours below is the amount of forest in green, and then in yellow it's more open forest, and then in orange you've got grassland, and that moves along with time to your left. So you've got 2,000 years at the top, and then 10 to 15,000 years at the bottom. So you can see that a more of an open grassland landscape developed after 9,000, but there's still this period between 9 and 10,000 where you've got these banana microfossils, which are really intriguing actually. And there's some of the microfossils that you find. In the bottom corner there are some, or what are called Umusa type banana phytoliths, which is what were found in that particular deposit, which is really interesting. I'll skip through because I'm running out of time. I'm going to head back up into the highland areas of Papua New Guinea. This is one of the first major finds of, initially was one of the earliest archaeological sites on the Huon Peninsula, where you found a lot of these wasted axe blades. And this is, I'm just going to go through some of the different types of environments there and suggest what kinds of food sources might have been available to New Guineans. In the savannah, it probably had relatively few economic plants, right in the lowland areas there. You move up in elevation a little bit into lowland rainforested areas, you've probably got numerous economic plants like sago and banana and many fruit and nut trees. You've got, heading up in elevation up to about 2,000 metres, you've got some fruit and nut trees, and you've got Caruca pandanus, which I'll talk a little bit about in the last few minutes I have. And then as you head up further, basically you only get limited to things like tree fern, which is hence my sort of little focus on tree ferns here. So you've got to head up to about 3,000 to 4,000 metres and you end up with a tree fern and grassland dominated landscape like this. This is at the Neon Basin at 3,200 metres in the Owen Stanley Range. And you can go around, walk around there, and you've got these pockets of tree ferns dotted in little gullies everywhere. And this is part of my experiment. So I was just cutting up different trunks of tree fern to see whether you could actually, we could roast it on a fire and cook it up and see whether you could consume it. So I brought some back and had some tests done on it, and it's perfectly consumable, no problems at all. But the locals wouldn't touch it, so which was interesting. And there are animals up in this particular area, but it is generally probably quite resource poor, really, in terms of other food sources. I mean, people hunt pigs now, but this whole problem that when we deal with archaeology, we're often dealing with a lot of absence of evidence, but it's quite likely that there was a lot of megafauna similar to what we found in Australia with diprotonons and zygossus, these large echidnas. We're probably frequenting areas like this up in New Guinea, and that's probably what people were operating in back in the Pleistocene. But because we've got so few sites with bones of megafauna, we really don't know. We only make that assumption on what was probably occurring in Australia. So large assumptions there. And then, of course, you've got the nival zone, right up in the really high, 4,000 to 5,000 metres. You've got glaciers, you've got really precarious environments. This is basically, it's just somewhere where humans wouldn't have really operated in much at all because of the lack of resources. There's no real reason for them to do that. But as climate's changed, at about 40,000 years ago, the climate depressed. It was much cooler, and so the Scythia grassland environment was much more widespread than it is now. So this is getting into some of the areas where most of the Pleistocene archaeology is actually being found within the Scythia grassland environment. So what were people doing in that kind of environment, and what carbohydrates were they eating? So this is one of the key questions that we have, and in my mind, I think that tree ferns are important, and we've got some evidence for this. And there's the extent of shifting rainforests. You can see that New Guinea's, and during these glacial climates, New Guinea was connected to the Australian landmass as well. So everything changed quite substantially. And we've got these pollen records. Again, here's the same colours that I showed before with the contraction of forest, and you've got evidence for humans there because they're burning off the landscape as well. This is the Tari Basin. It's a little similar to what you saw for Cook Swamp there, a similar elevation. And then you've got Kossipi Swamp, and this is Jeff Hope, I've been working with for years now on Kossipi, and he first went there in the late 60s, and just some images here. And in the foreground here, you see a Caruca pandanus, which is one of their major crop plants that you find, crop trees, within the periphery of the swamp. Here's an aerial shot of the current mission station that's there, which has largely been abandoned now. There's 2 houses left. It burnt down in 1997 in the major fires. And just quickly, what's intriguing about that particular landscape, and New Guinea as a whole, you can almost treat the whole of New Guinea like a Pompeii, if you know the famous Roman site. There's layer upon layer of volcanic ash that regularly douses New Guinea. And 60 to 70,000 years ago, there was a really massive eruption, which was a super eruption, which covered much of the Owen Stanley Range. And it's found in different places and sections of rivers and so on, and you can see it. And at the base of there, you can see that major 70 to 60,000 year ash layer. This is an archaeological excavation, believe it or not. It's just a profile out of a hill slope. And that black layer is the living surface, or where we find most of the artifacts. Doesn't look like much, but it's full of charcoal, and it's full of nuts, little charred nuts of the Caruca pandanus, dated to between 45 to about 20,000 years ago. And then above that, the site gets reworked. So this is the earliest site, archaeological site in Papua New Guinea, and there's some of the stone tools that have been found from that site. There's numerous other sites that have been dug up, and they show very similar features, and that was published in Science a few years ago. But on your right are some images of the charred nuts that have been located from there. And then on the left, you've got starch grains from things like yams. So we've actually got evidence for nuts and yams. So both of them, the nuts themselves are quite high in protein, but they also do in fact produce a lot of carbohydrate too. And then of course there is yams too, which are probably not actually growing at that site because 40,000 years ago it was probably too cold. So one of the theories expressed in the paper was that In fact, people were actually bringing yams up and going on hunting expeditions. But I'm not so sure about that, and we've been looking more at different microfossils from this particular site to see whether, in fact, there are other starch-producing plants that people are actually getting into. And we're not really sure at the moment convinced whether the main lot of starch fossils that we find are in fact all from yams. So that's still work in progress. The bottom diagram there shows the comparison of nut sizes. So you can see each little dot there is, well, the little cross there, I think there was in the order of about 60 nuts of these fruits found in one particular section. And then Andrew Fairburn, who's at University of Queensland now, has looked at modern nuts and found that there's a distinct morphology of the actual archaeological nuts. So they're quite different from all of the different nut types that you find today. So it's quite interesting. So it's possible that there's some other sort of manipulation process of those trees and of those nuts that's been ongoing since the Pleistocene. So it's really intriguing stuff. Just some more old images of the site. Tim Flannery first got going and working in New Guinea at Kossipi, actually. Jeff Hope introduced him to New Guinea in 1981, and there he is. That's at Kossipi Station there. When he first got stuck into mammals, which was his primary science interest at that time. That's up on the Neum Basin. That's the modern site there today. I spent quite a lot of time travelling around with local people trying to understand what they actually do with the pandanus. And so you can see these big flanges. There's a boy on the back there who's got these large flanges. Some of them are about this big, but others are like this big. And these are very tall trees. They're much taller than coconut palms. And they'd climb up there and knock them off, and then they'd make these stakes and they'd carry them down, and they'd be going on huge expeditions to harvest these things. They also cut down the pandanus to build thatch and walls for houses, so it's a very useful tree. And then they take them back and they roast them. So you can either eat them quite fresh, you can cook them immediately, or you can roast them like this woman has done here. And that will keep you going for weeks. And they will do that during the peak season of the Karuka harvest. They would be harvesting, huge amounts of this, which they can store over a season. So roasting is a key feature here, and that can keep people going in the off season as well. So I suspect that roasting is probably the most important process here, but it's also producing a lot of sugars as well. So the outer layer, it's all caramelized, the nuts are caramelized, and they're producing a lot of sugar. And that's, getting back to that site from Morocco, I think it's a similar thing that's operating in New Guinea with Karuka pandanus, that's what people are really getting into. We did coring, and I think I'll probably draw to a close there because we're really running out of time, just showing you some of the other sections that we're digging. And including in the swamp as well, where we found stone tools, as well as more evidence for starch fossils and other fossils, indicating what other kinds of plants were available for carbohydrate consumption at that time as well. Activities today include, hunting pigs. So this is right up at 3,500 metres where boys go on big pig hunting expeditions with their dogs. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Do we have questions?
I'm happy to ask questions.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned the volcanic eruptions in Leo and Stanley and so on. What is the evidence for how severe they were? Were the people wiped out a couple of times with these things?
Well, in New Guinea, I mean, there was a PhD student at the ANU who did a whole thesis on that, and there's a couple of key traditions that were collected in the 60s of varying groups from across New Guinea and talking about the time of darkness. And that refers to, we think, in terms of people have like tracked back their genealogies to an eruption occurring in the 1600s, the Tibeto eruption, and different tribal groups trace their ancestry back to that particular time, because it might have been a time when either a lot of people perished or they simply moved location. And it's something I'm really interested in Papua New Guinea and places like the Solomons, which are incredibly volcanically active, and looking at how people actually work around volcanoes. And some of the work I've been doing recently suggests that, in fact, in some areas, volcanoes are a major source of productive soils. So they might get replenished by eruption. People might leave a village and then come back after the eruption and suddenly have their soils replenished. And that's a huge advantage for a subsistence society. So people might live precariously on the edge of a volcano, but they take that risk because they have the huge advantage of being able to produce a lot more food and carbohydrates, I should add. Yeah.
With the exception of the matter of tooth decay, were these diets especially healthy in any way? Were they balanced? Were they like good physiologically for the people?
I mean, that's a huge question, and that's something. I mean, as I say, we've got very little paleopathological evidence for Pleistocene diets in Papua New Guinea. So, because there's very few burials that we have access to of that age, so it's very difficult to tell. I couldn't give you an answer. I mean, yeah, that's difficult. In modern populations, certainly. I mean, that varies depending on different stressors as well. Like they have had periods in the recent past, like in 1997, which burnt out the Kosipe mission station. That was a huge burden on the whole of New Guinea at that particular time. Caused a lot of starvation in some of the poorer areas of New Guinea, especially in the Fly province. There was substantial starvation there. So there are clearly areas that would be stressed under certain conditions, and so that causing malnutrition and so on. In terms of balanced diet, I mean, at Kosovo today, I mean, they have a fantastic diet up there. They've got like the best beans and corn I've ever had. Their corn is just incredible because you've got these rich volcanic soils. The fallow periods for the soils are really quite long, so they've got incredibly rich soils. So you eat this really, and it's grown at high elevation too. So a lot of the crops respond differently and they produce different sugars, so the flavours are really different. And pretty good food value, I would say. So my short time in different parts of New Guinea suggests that people do eat a pretty balanced diet today. But as far as the Pleistocene is concerned, very difficult to tell. I can't imagine they would have eaten a balanced diet in these sort of tree, fern, grassland environments. Although they could have had a lot of hunting success, and you can live off meat for an awful long time without too much trouble. But carbohydrates, still you've got to have them. Yeah.
Yeah, what are some other ways that you examine fossil evidence to determine the kind of things that people ate in previous years gone past, besides just looking at their teeth?
Well, as I say, from an archaeological site, we'd have the macrofossil remains, the things of like the nuts that we might find. We had those little starch green fossils as well, which are from starch-producing plants. They can often be found embedded within stone tools, so you know that people have like been processing them with those stone tools as well. We haven't found any evidence for any pounders from the Pleistocene, but we've got a lot of stone pounding tools from later age deposits, many thousands of years old, which have starch and other types of microfossil materials as well, which tell us that they're processing particular kinds of foods. And then there are other techniques which I was going to illustrate a bit later, I ran out of time, but there's a whole lot of different molecular fossil techniques now too, which can look for specific compounds from very small amounts of material, which can actually tell you potentially about what kinds of foods might have been operating in that particular environment too. So there's a number of different techniques that are being employed in different places now to try and build up that picture. Yep.
Any more questions? No? Okay, well, I think we'll bring the evening to a close. So thank you very much, Matt, for a very excellent speech. So thank you very much.